When you say empire, you usually imagine armies, conquests, and maps painted with colors. But in the 20th century, a different kind of empire was born, one that didn't even need soldiers. It wasn't horsemen occupying lands anymore, but men signing papers. Cities were not conquered by marching armies, but by men in suits carrying loan agreements in their briefcases. The place where this shadow empire was most visible was Latin America. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, didn't go there just to lend money. It rewrote economies, determined national policies, and shaped the destiny of hundreds of millions of people, all in the name of stability. But the side it truly served was the creditors. This contradiction was one that sent shivers down the spine. The IMF was founded in 1944 at Bretton Woods. Its goal was to stabilize exchange rates, stop economic collapses, and help countries recover after the destruction of war. It looked like the doctor of the financial world, to heal, to balance, to give struggling nations a chance. But in Latin America, this doctor quickly turned into something else, a debt collector. No matter how much the patient suffered, the only thing that had to be paid was the money owed to the banks in New York and London. To understand this, we need to look at Latin America in the mid-20th century. Countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina wanted to industrialize quickly. Industries were being built with protective tariffs. State companies were expanding. Social peace was maintained through food and fuel subsidies. Politicians promised growth today and paid for it with credit tomorrow, and tomorrow's bill would be huge. In the 1970s, the world experienced a flood of credit. Oil prices rose, petrodollars accumulated in Western banks, and those banks were eager to lend. Latin American leaders saw this as an opportunity. Borrow dollars, build infrastructure, finance social programs, keep the political machine running. Roads, dams, factories, railways, all financed by foreign money. It looked great. Growth was strong. Politicians were popular. But there was always a but. That but came in the early 1980s. When Paul Volcker became head of the U.S. Federal Reserve, he raised interest rates sharply to break inflation. Overnight, cheap loans turned into heavy debts. A loan once taken at 5% interest suddenly rose to 15 to 20%. Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina could no longer pay. In 1982, Mexico's Minister of Finance went to Washington and said, "We can't pay our debts." It was the declaration of financial collapse. The IMF was waiting, ready. But while the IMF offered help, it also brought conditions that completely changed societies. Food and fuel subsidies were cut, currencies were devalued, wages frozen, public enterprises privatized. Spending on health, education, and pensions was reduced. With the new loans given in return, budgets were written not in the Congresses of Mexico City or Buenos Aires, but in the offices of Washington. And those budgets had one single priority: to pay back the money lent by the banks. For politicians, the IMF was like a shield. They could say, "We have no choice. The IMF is forcing us," a perfect excuse to direct the pain onto the public. Bread became more expensive. Public employees lost their jobs. Schools lacked funding, but foreign creditors were safe. Latin America became a laboratory of austerity. The people became the test subjects. The results were painful. Between 1980 and 1990, the region's GDP per capita fell. Countries became poorer, while billions of dollars were paid abroad as debt repayments. Economists called it the lost decade. Growth stopped, inequality increased, poverty exploded, but the debts remained. It was like a drowning man forced to hand over his wallet. And this was not just about numbers. In Caracas, riots erupted when fuel subsidies were cut. In Buenos Aires, protests broke out when wages froze while prices rose. Hunger, unemployment, political turmoil. Some regimes collapsed. Others used IMF-backed repression to legitimize control. Although the IMF presented itself as neutral and technocratic, the truth was this: it was not neutral. It ensured that payments were made and that the system was preserved. Money and power always flowed upward. Mexico collapsed in 1982, and this spread like dominoes. During the oil boom of the 1970s, Mexico had borrowed heavily. When oil prices fell and interest rates rose, the truth emerged. Wall Street was shaken. Not only Mexico, but dozens of countries that had borrowed under the same logic were in trouble. Banks in New York, London, and Frankfurt faced the threat of systemic collapse. The IMF entered the stage, not as a savior, but as the power keeping the global banking system stable. But the conditions were clear. New loans would be given. In return, spending would be cut. State companies sold. Economies opened to market rules. Thus was born the Washington Consensus: liberalization, fiscal tightening, deregulation, and the sale of public enterprises. In theory, it would bring efficiency. In practice, it tore apart social safety nets and transferred public wealth to private, mostly foreign, investors. The example of Bolivia made it into textbooks. In 1985, due to hyperinflation, prices rose by thousands of percent. The IMF and local technocrats prescribed shock therapy. Subsidies were abruptly ended, the currency was devalued, and public spending was cut. Inflation fell, but the price was heavy. Unemployment, mine closures, abandoned villages. Stability on paper, hunger and despair on the ground. Argentina showed how the IMF's prescription could turn into poison. In the 1990s, Argentina implemented IMF policies, pegged its currency to the dollar, privatized industries, cut deficits. At first, it seemed successful, but debt piled up, exports lost competitiveness, and social tension rose. In 2001, the system collapsed. Banks froze accounts, people lost their savings. Buenos Aires erupted. Que se vayan todos. All of you, get out, became the chant. The IMF's reputation was shattered. The same pattern appeared across the region. In Brazil and Peru, IMF programs reduced inflation, but left a legacy of inequality. They destroyed protections for workers and the poor. Why did politicians accept this? Because the IMF provided them with political cover. When the crisis came, they could say, the IMF wants it this way. The public saw their wages cut, subsidies disappear. Leaders said, we had no choice. Why were the 1980s the lost decade? Because average income fell, poverty rose, investments in education and health collapsed, yet billions of dollars were still sent abroad in debt payments. The irony was this: during this period, Latin America should have caught up with developed countries, but instead fell behind. Generations lost prosperity, Wall Street banks were saved. Understanding the power balance is crucial. The IMF was presented as a neutral referee, but in reality, its decisions were political. The board was dominated by the US and Europe, the centers of the banks holding the debt. The IMF's mission was clear: to protect the system, even at the cost of sacrificing people. Sovereignty eroded not through invasion, but through spreadsheets. National budgets were written from offices of those who didn't live in those countries. Even more frightening, Latin America wasn't just a region in crisis, it was a laboratory. The IMF tested austerity, privatization, and structural adjustment policies there, then applied them elsewhere. The 1997 Asian crisis, 1990s Russia, post-2008 Greece, the Latin American tragedy turned into a global doctrine. And this brings us to a more disturbing question. Was the suffering in Latin America just the result of bad economics? Or was it the price of maintaining a global financial system that protects the interests of creditors? The dark truth is this: today's high debt levels in developed countries resemble those conditions of the 1980s. When debt becomes too high, sovereignty becomes negotiable. If the numbers don't add up, others will decide your future. In Greece, after 2008, the Troika implemented a similar prescription. Loans were given, but in return came painful reforms, pension cuts, public wage reductions, tax increases, and the sale of public assets. Just like in Buenos Aires, in Athens, people heard, there is no alternative. Today, Italy, Japan, and even the United States carry huge debts. The difference is that investors still believe they can be repaid, but belief can vanish overnight. If interest rates remain high and economies stagnate, IMF-style adjustments can appear anywhere. The deeper truth is this: debt is not just a number, it's a tool of control. Latin American leaders brought growth to the present while pushing the bill into the future. The IMF turned that debt into leverage, dictating what a country could or could not do. Now, developed nations have reached unprecedented debt levels. The same trap is closing. It may not always be called austerity. It may be sold as fiscal discipline or market order, but the essence is the same: budgets rewritten to protect creditors, while citizens pay the price. Latin America's lost decade must not be forgotten. That period showed how money and power move, protecting the few at the expense of the many. The region was used as a testing ground, the human cost ignored. The result? Decades of slow growth, rising inequality, and stolen opportunities. But there is another path in this story. If you understand the pattern, you don't have to be its victim. Individuals don't control IMF policies, but they can control how they think about debt, savings, and wealth. Your grandfather may have trusted banks that collapsed. Your mother may have believed house prices would always rise, only to face disaster. If your retirement funds are tied to speculative markets, they are at risk. The lesson from Latin America. Don't confuse illusion with real wealth. Real wealth isn't what systems you can't control promise you. It lies in assets that keep their value, in skills that don't lose worth, in networks that can't be privatized, and in diversified investments. Most importantly, learning how the system works is the path to financial freedom. Freedom doesn't come from waiting for the state to save you, but from seeing the traps before you fall into them. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes in painful ways. When money stops flowing, when trust collapses, the pyramid falls. And if you mistake the pyramid for the foundation, you'll be crushed beneath it. If what I've told you made you see the world differently, subscribe. History hides the answers, and I'll help you find them.